Hey, what's going on there, guys? Back again with another tutorial related to the SpaceX NASA collaboration. This time we're going to be animating this image of both Doug Hurley and Bob Beacon using Photomotion Horizon. As usual, we will first be splitting this image into 3 different layers: the clean plate, Bob here, and then finally Doug. Now, when we get to animating our image, we will also be adding a small displacement map on top of both Doug and Bob, adding an extra layer of movement. So let's get to it. First, we'll begin by bringing in our image into Photoshop and creating a duplicate from our background layer just over here, and as usual grabbing the quick selection tool and creating a quick mask of Doug here. We'll then go to select and mask just over here to start really fine-tuning our edges. Now we'll brush over this next bit, but there are of course a range of tools that will help you with this process. Just remember that it's really important to make sure that this is as accurate as possible, so take your time, and after we're done, of course, let's go to output and change this selection to new layer with mask, which will create a separate layer of just Doug here and none of the background. What we'll then do is just ensure that our selection is visible, and then we'll disable this layer and enable this layer 1, ensuring that it's also selected. And once we've done that, we'll head over to select, then modify and expand. We don't want too much, as 10 pixels will probably do for now, and once we're happy, we'll right click on this selection and click fill, and use content aware to fill in the space behind Doug. Okay, well, you can see this is far from perfect. We'll also have to start rebuilding this image of what we expect to find behind Doug. Feel free to use your own imagination on what you think is behind there, but we're just going to show you what we think for now. Okay, so we're also going to use the lasso tool to grab this beam just over here and flip it horizontally. We're then going to move it just over here and align it to this person here and the others, and use the eraser tool to just get rid of these edges over here. And once we're happy, we'll make sure to merge our background with this layer. Okay, so we can use other tools like the clone stamp tool to paint back in some of these features and get rid of others. We'll also use the polygon or lasso tool to help us create some secure edges using feather so it's not so obvious, and then we can just use the clone stamp again to paint these areas in. So it's all about looking around the image, seeing parts which look appropriate, and then repurposing them for the clean plate. So once we're happy with our clean plate, let's look behind layer 1, and don't forget of course to save your actual project. The very last thing you need is Photoshop to crash for one reason or another, and you've of course sunk in a good portion of an hour or more getting this far. Okay, so the next step is again grabbing the quick selection tool and creating a layer from Bob and these railings here. With objects like these, be extra careful to be as precise as possible, using tools like the polygon or lasso tool to your advantage in creating a pinpoint selection of this layer. Go again to select and mask, and as we can see, there are a few areas within the selection which need a little bit more TLC, so let's get to sorting those out now. We have this helmet here which needs some work, his arms, and not to forget of course this railing over here. Okay, with our selection finally complete and Bob and this railing over here are within the new layer, let's right click here and select fill, and again see what happens if we use content aware fill. Okay, so we have got a bit of a muddled background, and we can particularly see this if we enable and disable these 2 layers here. So let's go to the patch tool over here and see about fixing some of these problems that we're seeing. Again, what we're doing here is essentially rebuilding parts of this image which content aware has gotten wrong, and you can use a myriad of tools to help you out in order to get the result that you want. Okay, so after some time, here's the result that we have. We could do a little bit more, but for the animation that we have planned, there'd be virtually no use for it. So again, do what you feel is necessary for your project in order to save some time. Right, so let's rename these layers quickly so we can save some time and annoyance in After Effects. Doug here will be layer 1, Bob here of course will be layer number 2, and our clean plate, well, is our clean plate. Let's have another look. Yeah, that's looking decent enough, so let's bring this into After Effects. First, let's load up the latest version of Horizon and double click on this Start Horizon button over here. When we reach this main dashboard, we're kind of blocked off from doing anything else by clicking on this button, Add Photo. So let's click on that now. We'll then get to importing our Photoshop projects into After Effects, and we'll encounter this pop-up here, and we'll set the import kind to composition. We don't want to be merging all of these layers back into one after all. We'll then want to grab our clean plate layer from the project window and bring it into this composition. We'll then of course parent it to this layer on top of here, making sure to hold shift as we do so. Okay, so as usual, let's scale this from the layer on top, not the base Photoshop layer, and once it's snug within our viewport, let's jump into our main dashboard. As you can see, all of our horizon floor options are now available, but of course let's not do anything just for now and focus on getting the rest of our layers in the project. Okay, so let's click on the layer 1 button on the main dashboard and then click on import, and once again we're going to go to the project window and bring layer 1, Doug here, into our composition. Just parent him to the layer on top while holding shift in order to copy the scaling attributes from the clean plate. Next, we'll go back to the main dashboard and do the same with our second layer. First though, let's take a moment to think about whereabouts we're going to put it. So we could put our second layer into layer 2, but we lose the ability to put something in between them within this 3D space. Say for example, like some text. So by putting Bob into layer 3, that gives us the option even if we intend not to use it. So just double click on the button layer 3, then import, and lastly, let's drag Bob over here into the composition, hold shift while parenting, and that's all of our layers set up. Our next step is of course to set up our cage, so let's expand it by dragging these side panels over here further out and then expand our height a little bit more too. Right, so we'll also want to change the back rotation, and we can do that by just going to effect controls while our back plate is selected, and then maybe add some rotation to it while we're at it. We'll also move our cage slightly so it fits the surrounding room, and then some rotation to this floor panel. Around about 90 degrees should do the trick. Okay, so with our cage set up, let's click on this animation button over here and then click on this checkbox in effect controls, and now all of our animation properties like our controller, say for example, will appear. We'll then want to bring our needle to the 30 seconds point, a second to be precise, and then we'll hit N on our keyboard to mark out our working area. So with our playhead in position, let's go to our controller now and create some zoom by clicking on the magnify icon over here and going over to either the control zoom layer or effect controls. We'll then adjust the controller slightly, and then we'll also add some tilt here by clicking on the icon left to the controller and adding some rotation in, and then we'll be adding some more movement to the left by clicking on the right side of the controller and adding some movement to the left. So now we have the problem where we're encountering some negative space here, which obviously we don't want within our animation. So click on this other button on the main dashboard and then drag this white edge fix. What that will basically do is just mirror out our background, and this kind of looks pretty good. We can also flip our animation direction in case we want to change it from zooming in to zooming out, and we can do that by just swapping our end keyframes over here with the beginning ones. So let's preview what we have so far. It looks alright, but maybe a little bit too simple, so let's see if we can bring some more dynamic features into the animation. Let's first push layer 3 a little bit further to the back by changing the position. That way there's a little bit more separation between Bob and Doug here. We'll also tweak our animation slightly so there's a little bit more space between Doug and the background to the side of the frame. After all, within Horizon, we do want to showcase some of the environment that they're in a little bit more. Feel free to tweak and push this animation any direction. Just make sure that if you've left any imperfection in your clean plate, they're not visible within the final animation. Next, we'll set up some camera blur, and we can do that from the camera settings layer. However, before editing these values down here, keep in mind you will have to enable the effect first, and you can do that by just clicking this box, depth of field. Again, all of these values are within effect controls as well. Now, this is a little bit too much at the moment, so let's think about dialing it down slightly, maybe something like 7, say for example. Once we're happy with that, let's get to adding in some particles into this project by going over to the settings button on the main dashboard and then clicking the activate particles checkbox within effect controls. We probably don't want these petals, so let's choose something like number 16, these little specks over here. We'll then want to defocus some of these in the background as to match our depth of field effect, otherwise it might look a little bit funky. So we can do that by clicking on each individual particle button, middle, further and distant, and ramping up the defocus slider just over here. Once we're finished, let's go back to the main settings of all these particles and maybe take down some of the highlights via this curve and change it to alpha and bring it down a tad as to make sure they're not popping out as much within our scene. Right, so let's also fiddle with the colors within our animation as well by going over to the colors over here and maybe adding a slight S curve, adding a little bit more contrast. Maybe let's increase the size of the curve UI so that we can make some extremely precise and subtle changes, changing some of the overall RGB levels. Okay, so it's looking really decent right now. Let's go over to layer 3 and brighten up Bob here so he's a little bit more noticeable. So after we're happy with the way our colors are set, let's go back to the beginning of our composition and preview our animation. It's looking okay, but as you can see, when we move our controller, we're not really seeing any movement on either one of our subjects, especially Bob here. We can fix this by adding a very basic displacement map to our animation. So let's get to that now. Double click on layer 3 and click on this displace button just over here, and all we want to do is just click draw. Okay, so what we're going to be doing basically is, like within our portrait animation, painting on a depth map onto Bob here and these rails. So let's select this layer just over here, make sure our playhead is at the beginning of our composition, and then let's go to the brush and then just make sure that we've got this white brush selected, let's just double click on our viewport and start painting in our depth map just over here. So we don't want to be too harsh with this. We're not going into the same level of complexity as portrait, so a light touch here is all we require. We can see what we've already painted by just going over to the effect controls just over here and clicking on this paint on transparent checkbox. We still have some more work to do, so let's get back to Bob and continue on. Again, try not to be too harsh or methodical. We're only here to create a very basic depth map. Okay, so once we've checked our displacement map and we're all happy, let's go back to the main dashboard. At first, we're not going to see anything, and that's because our displacement controller isn't active. So click on layer 3 just over here on the right side of the dashboard, and then in effect controls, we're then going to want to check this show displacement controller checkbox. So what that will do is hide our main controller and replace it with this displacement controller, which you can use to animate the direction of your displacement map. And then what we'll want to do is move our playhead to the end of our animation and then move it to the center or any other direction, and obviously try and match it with the overall animation as much as possible. Once we're happy with our setup, let's do exactly the same with Doug just over here. However, first we're going to need to deactivate this layer's displacement controller. So again, go to the layer 3 button just over here and then go to the effect controls and untick this displacement controller checkbox we just clicked a second ago. Cool, so with our main controller back, let's go to layer 1 where Doug is and do exactly the same. Of course, just make sure that your needle is set to the very beginning of the composition, and again we're just going to select the brush again and begin painting in Doug's depth. Again, no need to be too detailed about this. Have a wide soft brush equipped and of course save yourself some time. So once again, let's check out what we've done. Looking pretty okay. Again, you don't need to do anything too advanced for this step. Okay, great. Let's go back to the main dashboard and click on layer 1 and then go over to effect controls and again click this checkbox to enable our displacement controller for this layer. We'll then want to move the controllers to the left, bring our playhead forward and then move our controller to the right and try to match the original animation the best we can. Now currently our animation is sitting around about on the 30 frames mark, 1 second to be precise, so let's change our frame count to timecode and change the duration of the animation. For something like this, maybe around about 5 seconds should do the trick, so let's bring our playhead over here and then mark out. Then, making sure that we can see all of the layers that have animations on them, drag all of these keyframes on the composition to the very end of your timeline. For any tip, you can hold shift to enable snapping, which will snap them into position, again saving you just that little bit extra time. Cool, so now our animation is 5 seconds long. So let's go to layer 1 over here and bring our animation controller back. So take care at this point not to do too much if you're going to tweak your animation, otherwise it's going to make your displacement animation look a little bit funky. Okay, so we're almost ready to begin rendering our animation. Let's make sure to change this resolution so it's set to 4K by going over to the resolution button on the main dashboard and then changing this export resolution to 4K instead of 1080p. Okay, so now that we're done within the main dashboard, let's double click on this export button over here and immediately you'll see that because our playhead is sitting on the 5 seconds mark, Photomotion Perfect Cut System is giving the green light for 0 loops. So if we wanted more loops, we'd change this time code back to frames and type out the desired loops we wanted, say for example something like 300 frames, which would be 1 loop. Let's type 300 in here, then mark out, and now Perfect Cut is giving us the green light for exactly 1 loop. Cool, so let's also think about adding in some effects here by going over to the effects on the viewport and then clicking on this light leaks button, maybe adding a couple of these within our animation. Okay, so this one looks okay, so let's just copy, and then when we get back to our render composition, paste it into our layer and make sure to drag it under this layer, otherwise we're not going to be able to click on the buttons on our viewport. We'll also drag this fade out to the very end of our work path. Right, so this is okay. Let's add some more particles on top of this layer by going over to effects again, then to particles, and then scan around for the quantity of particles that we want. Maybe something further out of the center of the frame. This one will do. So much like again, click on it, copy it, and then go back to the render composition and paste it there. Once again, we'll need to drag this fade out marker to the very end of our working area. Let's also change our composition length back to no loops by going over to the frame count and typing back in 150 and then marking out. We'll also need to make sure to drag these fade out markers back to the 150 frames point where our workspace ends. So if we preview it now, we can see all of these layers below and the animation really gel together quite nicely. Looks really cool. So we're ready now to render out. Let's go to composition and then click add to render queue just over here, and then we'll make sure that we're not exporting out as an AVR by clicking this lossless over over here and changing this AVI to QuickTime in order to render out a .mov. We'll also then hit OK, and then nothing left to do bar hit render. And there we are, our animation is now complete. We hope you've learned something cool and interesting within this tutorial, and as usual, if you're unsure about anything whatsoever, please do not hesitate to contact us via the live chat, and as usual, until next time.